as you can see, was basically to keep Mary young. At the time of Christ's death, Mary would have been 48, 49 years old. The way he depicted her, she was basically in her late teens, early 20s, and the full-size Christ figure. He diminished the wounds that usually were on other Pietas, very bold and very vivid, to cause a shock effect, and put a lot of subtlety. The left leg of Christ touching the tree trunk. Oh, okay, where did we put it? The left foot of Christ on this little tree trunk was to signify the tie between Christ and the living earth. Notice Mary's hand. She's accepting a combination of sorrow, but acceptance of what's happening, and her hand is out, stretched, basically indicating to the world that this sacrifice was made for you. Another subtlety of the carving.
Yeah.
Where is that smoking now?
It's in Rome at St. Peter's. The question was, where is the Pietà right now? It's at St. Petersburg in Rome.
St.
No, you
Peter's.
said the wrong thing.
Pardon?
St. Peter's.
What did I say?
Petersburg.
St. Peter's.
You're in Russia.
That's the wrong
Just to show you the subtlety and the capability. Notice the line on Mary's forehead. This carving was originally designed to be set on the floor in the French chapel at basically eye level. There was significant light coming in from above, and this piece of marble was extremely white. And Michelangelo realized he wanted the effect on Mary's face to have it somewhat darkened, as though there was a veil over her eyes. So he carved this little niche there that, while sitting on the ground, would cause a shadow to fall over the face. Now, I'll go back one. The Pietà I first saw in 1964 when I went to the World's Fair in New York City. And my first exposure to it, it was just awesome. The way they set it up, it was at ground level. They had a moving sidewalk in front of it. You were about 25 feet away from it and moved by, and so you could get the full effect. Unfortunately, recently, in 1972, a deranged geologist attacked the Pietà in Rome, knocked off Mary's left hand, her nose, and her eyelid. And the people who were viewing at the time, being good tourists, picked up the pieces, stuffed them in their pocket, and ran away. They were able to reconstruct the missing pieces from her back, but what they had to do, they've now put the Pietà behind glass, and it's elevated, so it's much more difficult to get the full impact of it. But this is just a magnificent piece. And notice the folds in the robe, and the hands and the muscles. Following completion of the Pietà, which ended up taking about 18 months, and the cardinal who had contracted him to do the work died, but still his successors wanted it and paid him. But he had very little additional work, but he gained great fame in in Rome as a result of that statue. But he wanted to go back to Florence, and so he went to Florence, and two events were happening at that time. For 30 years, the city of Florence and the Wool Guild had a 19-foot column of marble available, and there'd been some work done about 10 years before on it by a very poor sculptor, and he managed to gouge the side, and it was basically considered ruined. But the Wool Guild wanted to sponsor a competition to see who could design something out of it. Michelangelo competed along with 8 other artists. The 8 other sculptors withdrew after they studied the stone and didn't feel they could do anything with it. And Michelangelo proposed the design of David. A lot of unique things in this particular statue. One is the height. He was called the Giant in Florence because he's 17.5 feet tall. Again, it's basically done out of a single piece of marble. The flaw that existed was right in this area, and by cocking David's hips, he was able to work his way around it. Let's see, what are some of the other aspects that I definitely wanted to point out? Oh, the pose and the attitude of David. Other works that had been up to the time, of which there were numerous David statues around, either showed a meek David, a small David, a fully clothed David. Michelangelo's interpretation of the Bible in the Old Testament, there's one section about how David would be willing to protect the sheep from lions and bears with his bare hands. And so from that interpretation, Michelangelo decided David was not a weak person, and he had lots of confidence. His initial study, drawing study, he had David standing on Goliath's head with basically the same pose, but he didn't feel that the pose or the expression on the face was an after-the-fact one. It was a before-the-fact pose. If David was looking out, staring at Goliath, not fearful at all, fully studying him, and was really giving him the look, the evil eye. And there's a full view. The sling over his left shoulder, the stone in his right hand. And notice the use again of a tree rope down here to give the entire statue a base to stand on without detracting from the lines. And this is the rear view. I didn't mention before, but Gail had shown some drawings last week that Leonardo da Vinci had made of anatomical studies indicating that Leonardo da Vinci had obviously been involved in dissection and study of anatomy. That was done probably outside of Florence, somewhere where it was legal or at least allowed to be done. Michelangelo also was fascinated with anatomy, and in Florence, though, dissections were only allowed 2 days a year in front of the city council by 2 physicians. Otherwise, it was a hanging offense to be caught dissecting or mutilating a human body. Michelangelo made friends with a friar of the local monastery that also was responsible for processing the indigents who had died And through hinting and hemming and hawing, it was communicated between the two that this key on the desk was available if he wanted access to the dead room. So for 6 weeks, Michelangelo, basically 3 or 4 nights a week, from 12 p.m. to 3 a.m. would go into the dead room and dissect bodies. So he had a very capable and complete understanding of the human anatomy. The next piece that Michelangelo worked on, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of myself again. The other competition that was taking place in Florence at the same time was the great Leonardo-Michelangelo battle for the fresco that the city council wanted to have painted on the city hall. The left-hand wall, Gail had mentioned last week, Leonardo da Vinci did, but the paint started to run and it was a complete flop. Michelangelo just really craved, he still hated frescoes, but he really craved the opportunity to show his superiority. So he did all the cartoons and did on the right-hand wall. But because the left-hand wall was ruined, the contract was eventually canceled, and so they never did have a chance to compete on a head-to-head basis. So the next thing that Michelangelo became involved with, sculpture-wise, was Moses' statue. And this was being prepared for the tomb of Julius II, Pope in Rome, but the work was done in Florence. And this in itself is, again, a magnificent statue. The robe work involved in it, the beard, difficult to see, but the beard, even down to the most minute hair, had been carved out. I don't know if you can zoom in. That's a little bit better. And this is the look that Moses had just after he came down from the mount with the tablets. And he looked over at his people, and the beginning of the look of, would you call it disgust, disdain, oh my gosh, I'm not happy. And next step, he got up and threw the tablets down. This particular statue now is in the Church of San Pedro, I think, in Rome, and it's very popular with the Jewish community. And tourists come hundreds of thousands per year to view this particular statue. It's 8.5 feet tall. Anatomically, Michelangelo modified it a little, so the body, the upper portion of the body is really longer than the limbs would normally indicate it should be. But because of the seated position and the fact that this was sitting in a niche, this allowed him to emphasize the upper portion of the body and the head, which gave the impact and the effect that he was trying to convey. Shortly after the completion of that statue, Julius II called Michelangelo back to Rome and said, got a deal with you. They had a contract for Michelangelo to do 40 statues for Julius's tomb. He had completed 4 at the time. Julius was very slow about paying him, and he was a warrior pope and was dashing all over Europe fighting battles. And Michelangelo was getting pretty disgusted, but he was ordered back to Rome, and Julius proposed the deal that he had the opportunity of a lifetime to paint the Sistine Chapel. And he said, I don't want to paint, I don't like to paint, let me out here. And Pope said, no way, you're going to do the Sistine Chapel, and then we'll complete my tomb. So this is not a drawing that was used in the Sistine Chapel, but it's typical, and it gives me an opportunity to explain how frescoes are done. But basically, a preliminary drawing is done of the figure that he wants. Then it would be converted to what they call a cartoon, which is done on white paper. Then this cartoon is then a light layer of fresh plaster, Gail had explained this, is then put on the wall or the ceiling, covering an area of about 6 square feet. And the cartoon is usually placed up there, and then with a pointed stick, go along at about a 2 or 3 inch interval, depending on the capability of the artist, poke a hole in it, and then brush red chalk up there. So then when the paper is taken down, you have a red outline of the figure that's been drawn. And then the paint that's used on frescoes is a bit like watercolor paint. It's applied like watercolor with the lights going on first and then coming up with the darker shades last. And it's a pigmented paint. They grind up the pigment, mix it with water, sometimes mix it with egg or gum substance. And then it's applied with a horsehair brush, a lot like watercolor. So this would be typical of preliminary design that then would be converted to a cartoon and converted to the actual fresco. This is a view of the Sistine Chapel and what Michelangelo did. All of these figures along the top were his first project, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The chapel is 132 feet long, 42 feet wide, and 68 feet high. In fact, the building, the entire Sistine Chapel building, is modeled after dimensionally the temple in Jerusalem that was destroyed in 70 AD. So size-wise, that's where the dimensions came from, and the challenge was to come up with a design for the ceiling. Pope Julian wanted 12 apostles and miscellaneous adornment put up there. Michelangelo at this time was beginning to get a little ticked, and being the smooth talker and not bashful person that he was, he said, no, I'm going to do something different. And so he went off into the mountains for 4 months and gave it a lot of thought and came up with a design that we are all familiar with the iconic symbol in the center of the spark of life. And that comes from the main center section, which shows God approaching Adam. It's reported that Michelangelo actually completed the figure of God in 1 day. Painted the whole thing, did it without a cartoon, went up, did the sketch, did the painting. And if we go back 1 and 2, I'm sorry. Notice that all of the, at 68 feet high, Michelangelo designed the scaffolding to get his materials and himself up there that were anchored in holes bored in the side walls of the chapel. Completely hid his design. Contrary to the movie and a lot of speculation you heard, Michelangelo did not paint it on his back. And it's good for Charlton Heston, but no, he designed the scaffolding so that it curved and allowed him to stand and paint. But unfortunately, to do that, he had to lean backwards and look over his head and be painting up like this all the time. So at the end of the project, he almost had gone blind because of paint dropping in his eyes. And his eyesight never recovered fully. But he wrote a sonnet when he was through. His back ached, his butt had dropped to his ankles, and his head was about to fall off. Michelangelo at this time was 34 years old. It took him 4 years to complete the project after he started. Did most of the work himself. Now, again, it's a little bit of a myth that he worked totally alone because he needed a lot of help to bring supplies up and mix paints. Yes?
Did he do the back wall also?
Yes, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The question was, did he do the back wall also? Yes, he did. That's called the Last Judgment, and that's the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. The other interesting, just very briefly, there are 9 major sections in addition to the Spark of Life section in the middle, devoted to each of the 9 books of the Old Testament. There are 7 Old Testament prophets and 5 Old Testament sibyls. And anybody know what a sibyl is? It's a female prophet who foretold the coming of the Messiah. Altogether, there are over 300 figures in the ceiling. Many of these things that look like structural supports or arches in the ceilings are actually two-dimensional paintings by Michelangelo.
Did he get any help theologically from the popes, or I mean, where did he come up with all of this?
He was that well read
In the Bible?
in the Bible that he developed most of these ideas and interpretations and visions of what they look like by himself.
And did the Pope have any problems with any of these?
I'll mention briefly, not really. In the Last Judgment, there was a little bit of a problem. One of the popes were a little bit like, what's that Groundhog game where one pops up, they hit him with a hammer, he pops down, another one pops up. Well, they kept changing on a regular basis. Well, the Pope who commissioned the Last Judgment decided he died, and the next guy decided, you got to put pants on these people. And Michelangelo said, no way. And so they fought over that for about 3 months. Then the Pope died. And then the next one came out. Good project. So that's the shot of the Last Judgment wall. After completing the ceiling, Michelangelo, by that time, his fame had spread wide and far. He was receiving all kinds of commissions to do tombs. He was allowed to go back to Florence and complete work on Julius's tomb, which was now down to 28 statues from 40. Until the Pope got another Pope. This was Clement, who was actually a brother or a son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Called Michelangelo back to do the front wall of the altar wall. And that was 25 years had passed since then. So Michelangelo was then about 59 by the time he started to do this work. It took him 4 years to complete. Again, multiple figures, but not as many as the ceiling, and not quite as difficult to do because he was at least able to stand up straight. This is typical of what the figures look like. Very strong, masculine, muscular bodies. That's Christ and Mary on the left. Down here is Saint Bartholomew, who was skinned. And the face here is Michelangelo put himself in the picture. He didn't normally do that. But the last portion of Michelangelo's life, he was his architectural portion. I had not realized it, but Michelangelo was contracted to be the Vatican architect when he was 68 years old, and complete the work on the dome of St. Peter's. And at that time, St. Peter's had been under construction, and they were trying to build a dome and strengthen St. Peter's for almost 50 years, but progress was poor. They had a lot of cracking and breaking, and Michelangelo came in and did the design of the dome, but he didn't release the design to anybody. He supervised the work and allowed them to build it in stages, until he got to his early 70s and realized, I better tell some other people how I envision this turning out, so if anything happens to me, they can complete it. And he built the final model, and they built the dome pretty much to his specifications. It's 132 feet in diameter. The top of the dome is 432 feet from the floor of the chapel. So it's a stupendous engineering feat and construction feat. And the dome was finally completed after Michelangelo's death. And Michelangelo lived to be 2 months shy of 89 years old. And he continued to work up until the final 2 weeks of his life. He actually developed a cold. It turned into pneumonia. He went to bed for a couple of days, got up, tried to work again, then had a massive heart attack and eventually died of congested heart failure. So he had a full and complete life. Very quickly, I'll try to close out and still allow a few seconds for questions. I wanted to read a few of Michelangelo's own words to you. First, he said, "If we are pleased with life, we should not be displeased with death, since it comes from the hand of the same maker. The true work of art is but a shadow of the divine perfection. My soul can find no staircase to heaven unless it is through earth's loveliness. Lord, grant that I may always desire more than I can accomplish." And finally, "Many believe, and I believe, that I have been designated to this work by God. In spite of my old age, I do not want to give it up. I work out of love for God, and I put all my hope in Him." Of Michelangelo.